Well, hi, it's Good Friday today. Normally, everybody, of course, will be enjoying the bank holiday weekend, getting out and about, having barbecues, buying gardening equipment, taking a stroll on the beach. Many of us would normally be attending a church service, reflecting on the meaning and the death of Jesus all those years ago. But in the absence of meeting together, I want to share this message with you. But also, if you're not somebody who normally attends a church, you are more than welcome to listen in, and you can get a bit of a feel of what we talk about and why from the comfort of your own home. Today is sort of the sad and reflective day of the year for Christians, and it's a good thing Sunday is coming because that's the day of happy celebration, but Good Friday is the serious day. 2,000 years ago, Jesus was nailed to a cross. In itself, a fairly common event. Lots of people were crucified back then, but if you read what Jesus said beforehand, look at the detail of what happened when he was killed, and consider how his first followers understood it. The crucifixion of Jesus was like nothing else that ever happened. It stands over history as one of the most well-known events, but most people don't know much beyond the headlines. It's serious and gory and unpleasant, but like any great story, you travel through those things before you get to the joy at the end. Just now, I want to walk through how Mark's Gospel tells the story, and to some extent let the story speak for itself. All the four Gospels in the Bible tell the story from different angles, but the details match up incredibly. There is excellent reason to see this as a historically trustworthy account. So we're starting from Mark 15, verse 21. And this is just after Jesus has been on trial with the Jewish religious leaders who don't like his claims to be God. And then he's been assessed by Pontius Pilate. He was the Roman official in charge of the area. He's the one who had the authority to decide what would happen. And it goes like this. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. They brought Jesus to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Then they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. Dividing up his clothes, they cast lots to see what each would get. It was 9 a.m. when they crucified him. The written notice of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." They crucified 2 rebels with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by hurled insults at him, shaking their heads and saying, "So, you who are going to destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, come down from the cross and save yourself." In the same way, the chief priests and the teachers of the law mocked him among themselves. "He saved others," they said, "but he can't save himself. Let this Messiah, this King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Those crucified with him also heaped insults on him. Mark doesn't go into graphic detail about the crucifixion, but it was absolutely terrible. The Romans were brutal, but even they eventually banned it as a way of killing people. Before Jesus even got to the cross, the soldiers flogged him with a whip of braided leather thongs, with metal balls and bits of bone woven into them. In a flogging, often the back would be so shredded that parts of the spine were sometimes exposed by the deep cuts. The whipping would have gone all the way from the shoulders down the back of the legs. A 3rd century historian called Eusebius described the flogging by saying, "The sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews and bowels of the victim were often open to exposure." Many people died from this kind of beating before they could even be crucified. But Jesus still went to the cross. At the cross, the Romans then drove tapered spikes through his wrists, attaching him to a horizontal beam. The nails would go through the place where the median nerve runs, the main nerve from the hand, and his arms would have been stretched 6 inches and his shoulders dislocated. It was not over quickly. Jesus would have died an agonizing, slow death by asphyxiation. The stress on the diaphragm put the chest into an inhaling position, so that in order to exhale, Jesus would have had to push up using his feet, which were also pinned to the cross by a nail, remember, in order to relieve the pressure on the diaphragm and temporarily be able to exhale. In doing so, every time, the nail would tear through the foot, eventually locking up against the tarsal bones. This breathing motion would go on until the victim became exhausted and unable to push up and breathe anymore. But again, it would happen slowly. As Jesus slowed down his breathing, he would have gone into what's called respiratory acidosis. The carbon dioxide in the blood is dissolved into carbonic acid, causing the acidity of the blood to increase. This eventually leads to an irregular heartbeat. With his heart beating erratically, Jesus would have known that death was coming, and most likely he would eventually died of cardiac arrest. Along with the physical pain is the mockery. People have done this with Jesus ever since, but what happens here is a sort of microcosm of how people have always mocked Jesus. They question his claims. So the people mocking said, oh, he was the king of the Jews. In other words, he was the person that the whole Old Testament story are built up to. That's what he claimed. Someone who's going to rescue his people. And so they put a crown of thorns on his head to mock that. They question his identity. If you were really the Son of God, you wouldn't do this. This wouldn't happen to you. They question his trust in God. If God were really with you, this wouldn't happen, would it? Even the other people being crucified at the same time take the time to make fun of him. And then the story continues. At noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3 p.m, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? When some of those standing nearby heard this, they said, listen, he's calling Elijah. Someone ran, filled a sponge with wine vinegar, put it on a staff, and offered it to Jesus to drink. Now leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down, he said. The crowd mishear Jesus. They think he's calling for Elijah, a leader from the Old Testament who's been dead for centuries. And they use this to mock him too. Yeah, let's see if Elijah will save him. Yeah, right. But Jesus actually says, God, why have you forsaken me? He's quoting a psalm, but for the first time, he gets to the heart of what's actually happening here. As we've seen, the crucifixion was unbelievably physically painful, unimaginably awful. But it wasn't the worst thing. Jesus doesn't finally cry out in physical pain. He cries out about his relationship with God. The idea is that as the Son of God, Jesus has been in close relationship with God, his Father, forever. Imagine the closest relationship that you have and multiply it infinitely. On the cross, that relationship between Jesus and his dad is ripped apart. Jesus is physically torn apart, but in this moment, he's psychologically torn apart too. He experiences complete and utter loneliness and abandonment in a way that nobody else ever has. And the next verses tell us why. With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. The curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood there in front of Jesus saw how he died, he said, surely this man was the Son of God. So Jesus breathed his last. Now notice, what is the first thing Mark records in that moment? It's not how everybody reacted who was nearby. The first thing he goes to is that the curtain of the temple, that's the Jewish place of worship just up the road, is torn in two. And what's that all about? In Jewish worship, the temple was the centre. It was the place you would go to connect with God. But God was so big, so great, so up there, and everybody else was down here, you couldn't really access him. In the middle of the temple, there was one special area where the top priest could go once a year. It was this symbolic thing. That was how limited human access to God was. And it was covered by a curtain. When I say a curtain, I don't mean like a cheap shower curtain. It was 30 feet high, 30 feet wide, and 4 inches thick. The moment Jesus dies, something is completed, something is done. And it's this odd supernatural thing, but the curtain tears in two. Nobody popped in and ripped it. It tears from top to bottom. And even if even that is significant, the tearing starts up there, not down here. The torn curtain is God saying, it's all changed. I've done it. Anyone can access me now. That is what this means. And just to make that really clear, the first person whose reaction Mark records is the Roman centurion. This man was a professional soldier who leads 100 men and has overseen probably loads of crucifixions. He is not somebody who messes around. He has literally just taken charge of Jesus' execution. He's not Jewish, he's part of the regime that oppresses the Jews, and yet the Jewish author Mark goes to him first and shows us his reaction to show that as soon as Jesus had died, as soon as that curtain was torn, anyone could recognise who Jesus was, and now the way was clear through him for anyone to begin a personal connection with God. So that's why Jesus did it. That's why he undergoes the worst thing anyone has ever done. He gets broken in every sense a person can be broken to remove the dividing wall between man and God. But what's all this got to do with us as we sit in our homes in lockdown in 2020? I want to share two quick thoughts. Firstly, everything I just read was very deliberate. It was part of a plan. For me, one of the many reasons I'm a Christian is I can't get away from how much of what Jesus did was predicted by people who followed God hundreds of years before he was even born. In the Old Testament, a Jewish prophet called Isaiah said this: "Yes, it was our weaknesses he carried, it was our sorrows that weighed him down, and we thought his troubles were a punishment from God, a punishment for his own sins. But he was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We have left God's path to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all." Seemingly from nowhere to us, this man Isaiah talks about one person taking on the weight of the world. He uses words that describe a crucifixion centuries before it was even invented. And by the way, this is a full 800 years before Jesus was born. It was God's intention, his plan all along. If you read any of Jesus' own words too, spoken before he was crucified, it's clear that he knew what was coming. One of the Gospels records Jesus saying, well before his death, these words: "The Son of Man must suffer many terrible things. He will be rejected by the elders, the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. He will be killed, but on the third day he will be raised from the dead." That phrase, Son of Man, was an old title that Jesus assumed for himself. People expected that one day this Son of Man character would show up and do something special, but they would never have expected him to die. It's very strange, but Jesus knew that for him, rejection and execution were on the way, and it's clear that he believed they were necessary for some reason. Which leads to the second thought. It was all planned for us. We read that strange thing about the curtain being torn, and that being a symbol of it being possible to connect with God in this new way. But what was the problem in the first place? Why couldn't people connect with God? Theologians spend a lot of time talking about why Jesus needed to die, and it's certainly a multifaceted thing. But at the centre of the Christian message, and right at the heart of what the cross of Jesus is all about, is this. God is not a force or a gas or a compilation of human ideas. He's a person. He's a person with creativity and power and intelligence and justice and love. And out of love, he made the world in all its great richness and beauty. He put humanity on it so we could enjoy a relationship with him, and that he gave us the freedom to choose how to live our lives. But undeniably, we made a mess of that choice. We wage wars. We make petty comments. We obsessively desire what belongs to other people. We belittle people to feel better about ourselves. We build societies that stitch up the poor. We're racist and sexist and prejudiced. We're convinced that we're right about all of our opinions, but most of all, we each in our own way say to God, I am the centre, not you. It's all about me. Yet still God is full of love, and he wants a relationship with us, but he is so far up there, and we are so far down here. It's impossible for us to know him. That's why there's the plan. God was not surprised when humanity failed to be perfect. Remember those Isaiah verses from 800 years before Jesus. He was pierced for our rebellion. He was crushed for our sins. The Lord laid on him the sins of us all. That's why there was a plan. When someone does something wrong, when a relationship breaks down, you need forgiveness to fix it up again. And when someone forgives, it costs something. It costs you something to let go. That's why we hate asking for forgiveness, and it's why it's often painful to give it. When God forgives us, it costs big time. We cannot foot the bill. I remember when I was younger, one time I kicked a football at someone's car and I broke the number plate. But I was 9, so I didn't have the resources to pay for it. My dad had to pay for it instead. And it's just like that. On the cross, Jesus is God's solution, his payment. We have made such a mess, we wouldn't be able to fix up the relationship. Because God is a person, because he's personal, he experiences all the feelings that he should do because of how we treat him. Hurt, sorrow, disappointment, anger. Plus he is completely committed to administering justice. The only way for God to have any sort of relationship with us is he steps in himself like a good dad and deals with the problem. So he comes to earth incredibly as a human, does life the right way, takes on all our junk, all our sin, to use the serious word for it, and deals with it himself. It all gets agonizingly nailed to that cross. And it's this incredible thing that God would be up there standing over the universe and yet come down here and do that for you and for me. Roman crucifixion was an awful thing. It was too brutal. Jesus didn't just undergo it, he volunteered for it. He put his hand up and said, I'll do it. Now I want to ask you for a second, if you're a normal person, you will surely have questions and concerns about what Christians believe, issues about God and who he is and so on, and those should be engaged with. But can I ask you just for a moment to put those to one side and imagine if someone was willing to do this for you personally, what does it tell you about them? If this story is the truth about God, and therefore about your own life, is that not mind-blowing? Isn't it worth exploring and grappling with? Isn't it worth celebrating? So you know, this Easter time, Jesus knows mockery. He knows isolation and loneliness. He knows pain and isolation. If you're experiencing those things right now, he experienced them to a whole other level, and he did it to get you. We're far worse than we'd like to believe, and far more loved than we could ever have dreamed. And you know what? Sometimes I find people get into conversations about different worldviews, different conceptions of God, different religions, and they'll say of any particular view, well, it's a bit exclusive. You have to believe this and that and the other, and it's narrow in this regard, and I prefer to think this. Okay, let's turn that around for a second though. There is no other worldview where God did this for you. Christianity is certainly exclusive in this regard. There is nobody else who could do this, nobody else who would do this, nobody else who did do this for you. Just him, just Jesus. Have a think about that, and have a brilliant Easter.